American English, American English, American English webinar series. Teach and learn. American English webinar series.
Greetings, teachers from around the world. We are so happy to have you all here joining us for the second webinar in American English Webinar Series 5, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. Let's start out today with a quick look at this great photo submitted by Lejuste Mokuboka featuring English teachers gathered at the U.S. Embassy in Brazzaville in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They were gathered to view the first webinar in Series 5. We love seeing those photos of you all learning together and sharing ideas. Please do continue to share your webinar viewing group photos by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org. We might just feature them in the next webinar. I'm Heather Benucci, part of the American English team. You also know me as Moderator Heather. You'll also see Moderator Katie in the chat box today, helping you and supporting you as you participate. Here is our exciting schedule for Series 5. Our next webinar, Voice of America, Current Event Activities in the English Language Classroom with a repeat presenter, Phil Deerking, is going to be in 2 weeks on February 15th. It will be a good one. Our webinars are each 60 minutes long. Webinars are often related to a theme found on the American English website in the Teacher's Corner section. That section is shown here, and it features resources and lesson ideas related to each month's topic. The theme for this month is journalism. Now let's take a look at how you're going to participate in the webinar. During the webinar, you will hear but not see the presenter. The way you'll participate is to type in the chat box, as many of you are doing now. The chat box is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We may not be able to answer every question during the session, as there are often hundreds of you out there participating. However, there is another place to ask questions after the session is over, the Ning Community for Teachers, and we'll look at that in just a moment. The presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls. These multiple choice and multiple answer questions will appear on the screen for you to answer. And some of you, unfortunately, may experience technical problems during the webinar. We will let you know if we are having a global problem, and if you do lose sound, please do follow along with the caption pod at the bottom of the screen if refreshing your internet browser doesn't correct the problem. Each webinar series consists of 6 webinars, and during the series, webinars take place every other Wednesday. Those of you who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars will receive an e-certificate from your regional English language office or local U.S. Embassy after the series ends. To ensure you're eligible for that e-certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance information at the very end of the webinar. We will give you instructions about how to do this, and you will click on a link that we provide, and you will fill out the requested information in an online form. We hope most of you are already members of our Ning community, but if you have not yet registered, please do join us. It might take up to 72 hours for your Ning registration to be approved, especially since we're still at the beginning of a new series. Here on the Ning, you'll find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, as well as all of the webinar recordings and featured materials. The Ning community is also where you can ask the presenter questions after the webinar, and you can live chat with fellow community members, and our community is huge, over 11,000 members around the world. Are your students interested in learning more about using English for journalism? Participants in this free, massive, open online course, also known as a MOOC, will learn skills in reading, drafting, editing, and proofreading related to modern journalism techniques. The next MOOC is going to begin on February 20th. More information, including how to register, is available shown on the link here in the slide, and the moderator Katie is sharing in the chat box for you. We hope you will join us on February 20th. And now for today's webinar, Using News Sources to Enhance Learning in the EFL Classroom. Together, we are going to explore how to use news sources in ways that enhance language learning in our classrooms. The presenter will discuss activities that are useful for increasing vocabulary development, strategies for using news to teach listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and ways to find open source news items that are appropriate for your students' English level. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Eve Nora Litt. Eve holds 2 Masters of Science in Education degrees in teaching English to speakers of other languages and elementary education from the University of Pennsylvania. Eve is a language specialist in the University of Pennsylvania's English language program. She is taught in the Intensive English program, the Business Intensive program, and the Institute of Academic Studies. In the past, Eve taught at Drexel and Temple Universities and in Philadelphia Public Schools. She recently worked with the U.S. Department of State to help develop the English for Journalism Massive Open Online course, or MOOC, that we just talked about. Eve's professional interests include the use of technology in the classroom. In her spare time, she is passionate about studying the Arabic language. Welcome, Eve.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone greeting each other in the chat box, and I'm so happy to be here and honored to spend what is where I am the afternoon with you. So my name is Eve Nora Litt, and one of the reasons I love teaching a language is because many times there's flexibility with the content. So lesson plans, for me at least, focus on specific targets like grammatical structures or a set of vocabulary. But the content or the topics that we read about or listen to can be anything as long as it addresses those language targets. So for me, who loves to keep up with the news and follow news stories in my personal life, using the news in the classroom is one of my passions. So I'm very excited about this topic. Thank you for completing these pre-webinar polls. Let's take a look at the results. So it looks like 99% of you agree with me that you can use the news in your EFL classrooms to help students with language skills. So that's good that we are all in agreement that the news can be helpful. And it looks like most people, the most popular answer about where you get your news is online. And so I couldn't agree more. It's becoming easier and easier to access the news there. Also, newspapers are still popular. It's great to be able to put that in students' hands and see them react to the authentic materials, and of course, TV. So it sounds like we are using the news to teach different skills, not just reading, but also listening as well. So let's take a look at the structure of the webinar. In this webinar, I hope we answer 3 essential questions. What are the challenges and the benefits of using news sources in the EFL classroom? How can we use news sources to support language targets? And here, when I say language targets, I'm talking about those language skills. So the language objective of a given lesson. And this will be the bulk of the presentation. And finally, where can we find news sources for the EFL classroom? So that is something I hope we can continue to talk about on the NING afterwards, so we can share some good resources. So let's take a look at the goals. In terms of the goals, I hope by the end of this webinar, we'll have talked about creating lessons that use news stories. And these lessons will focus on language skills and not necessarily news content. So another way to say this is that we're focusing on using the news to teach language and not necessarily teaching the news. Our second goal here is to identify resources for level appropriate news for the EFL classroom. And again, we'll continue that discussion after the webinar on the NING. So before going back to that first essential question about benefits and maybe challenges, let's take a second to brainstorm some potential challenges. And I saw a lot of people add these on our pre-discussion NING board, which was great. But let's take that to the webinar here. write in the chat box, what are some challenges you find about using news sources in the classroom? And as that's populating, um, yeah, definitely. I see that a lot of people are talking about level. Absolutely. Technical issues, having access, motivation, vocabulary. These are, oh, culture and values. Fantastic. We're going to talk about a couple of those in this next section. Okay. So, one reason why a news source might be challenging to integrate into the classroom is because most stories are spoken or written in a way that is different than maybe academic style or storytelling style. So there is a reason for this. Generally, print journalists or reporters who write articles, they have like a maximum amount of space or maybe a maximum word count that the newspaper will dedicate to stories. And similarly, broadcast journalists, or those who deliver the news on radio or television or maybe internet video, they also have a limited amount of space for each news segment. So because of these limitations of time or space, journalists try to pack each sentence with as much information and as few words as possible. And that often results in maybe using complicated vocabulary or complicated grammatical structures. And that can be confusing for English language learners. And I can see a couple of you brought that up in the chat box. The structure of a news story, the way it's written, is also different than the structure that we generally teach in our EFL classrooms. So news stories, whether it's written or broadcast, they put that most essential information, the most important information right in the beginning. And then the least important information should go toward the end of the story. The assumption is that many readers or listeners, they don't have time to read the whole thing. So they want to put that most important information first. So the purpose of a news story, of course, is not to entertain, but to inform. And this is really different than an academic essay or basic storytelling. When we're teaching students to tell a story, we might encourage them to do that chronologically. This happened first, and then this happened. Also, if we're teaching how to write an essay, we might encourage students to start with an introduction that captures the reader's attention, maybe a statistic, some background information. And of course, a news story, or at least basic news stories, general news stories, that's really different. The structure of that's going to be different. So that can be a challenge. And another reason why journalism can be challenging is that sometimes it relies on that shared cultural knowledge. And I saw a couple of you actually brought this up too. Here's an example headline that I saw recently from USA Today. Mike Pence will wear lots of hats as Trump's vice president. And of course, the idiom to wear hats means to have many different responsibilities, not that Mike Pence will actually own many hats. So this shared cultural knowledge makes language less accessible to those who aren't familiar with these phrases or idioms. So the real challenge for using news sources in the EFL classroom is finding examples that are most appropriate for our learners, news stories that contain accessible language for where they are as learners of English. And so another thing we might want to consider is length. Giving students a long article can make them tired in a lesson, make them feel overwhelmed. So students at different levels of English can handle different input. A more advanced student can listen and read longer. So let's pause for a second to consider who are the learners you're working with now. Let's stop for a quick poll. So who are your students? Are you working with children under 6, children 6 to 12, children 13 to 18, college or university students? Are you working with adult learners or maybe a population I hadn't considered in this poll? And while you're completing that, I'll tell you that I work for a university and most of our students are over 18 and they're from all over the world. They have different levels of English, but for the most part, their goal is to attend a college or university that speaks English at least. So it looks like we have a lot of different groups here. Very interesting. We have most people, it seems, are working with children ages 13 to 18, which is a very interesting age where students are learning more about the outside world and able to kind of discuss these more complex topics. I see many people are also working in college and university settings. And also we have some working with younger children and adult learners as well. This is great. Sounds like a great mix of participants here today. Thank you. So this kind of brings me to another consideration when choosing an article for your classroom, topic appropriateness. So if I'm working with children, I probably want to stay away from certain topics that have violence or maybe politics. If I'm working with students from a specific country, I may not want to choose news from that country that might upset them or cause them to worry about their family. Because again, my students are here in the US. So I have to think about what they're comfortable talking about. I also might want to think about, sorry, I'm going to switch the slide, what they're interested in. What are their hobbies? What subjects in school are they most interested in? What do they like to read about? So all of these, getting to know my students really helps me figure out which news stories to use that will maximize their engagement in class. So we've talked about journalism voice and the linguistic complexity that comes with it. We've talked about background knowledge and general appropriateness. So we've talked a lot about the negatives. Let's move to the many, many benefits of using the news in our classrooms, because it does seem like most of us like to use the news. So if we could move to the chat box, now let's share some of the benefits of using news sources in the classroom. And I'm going to take a second to read. Wow. Yeah, a lot of my students also like music and celebrity news, so that can make them very interested in authentic language, motivation, vocabulary. Yeah, this is thank you so much for sharing this. One reason I like to use news stories or articles in my class is because it's authentic language, like many of you brought up. So let's take a second to think about what that means and how it compares to what we may rely on in our classrooms. So raise your hand using that button at the top of the screen if you're using a textbook or a workbook in your classroom right now. Oh, great. I can see a lot of people are using some sort of curriculum materials, a book or a textbook. Textbooks are great because authors organize the content with pedagogy or teaching philosophy in mind. Textbooks have modified English in order to provide many examples for specific language targets. But oftentimes textbooks can have examples or dialogues that doesn't necessarily reflect real-world usage of the language. In fact, researchers have found in a survey of ESL textbooks that language is sometimes reflected differently in the book than it is in real world. A quick example of this could be how we're taught in books that the proper response to thank you is, of course, you're welcome. But this is something that's kind of fallen out of our culture to say, at least American culture. Instead, people say like, no problem, or sure, or uh-huh, you bet. But very few people actually say you're welcome. So it's not, one way of using the news is to study that authentic language use, how people are still using the news. So not only do authentic materials show how language is being used, it can also help students build their receptive skills, like reading or listening. In fact, researchers have shown that when students are interacting with authentic materials, like a video or an article, they have positive gains in standardized tests with listening and reading skills. Another reason I like to use news sources with my class is because it's easy to find. And I know that that's not the case for everyone. I have access to local city newspapers or even campus newspapers at the university where I work. But with internet access and phones, social media, accessing the news has never been easier. So it's one reason I like to use it. And lastly, the news can be a creative way to help your students build academic skills or communicative English. So again, this is the bulk of the presentation. We'll talk about using the news to build those language skills, prediction strategies, comprehension, vocabulary building. So let's take a quick poll. When you use the news in your classroom, which skills do you like to focus on with your students? Are you using the news for reading, listening, writing, or speaking? Wow, I love seeing the responses that you're providing. I can see that reading is probably the most popular answer, and I can totally relate. I use the news for reading instruction a lot. Also speaking, very interesting. I'm hoping that after this webinar in the Ning, we can share some ideas about how to use the news in these different skills. So in this next section, I'd like to share with you different activities for using the news or to build language skills. So first, I'll introduce some activities that focus on the receptive skills, like the listening or reading skills. And then we'll also look at the productive skills, like speaking or writing. And finally, we'll look at some activities that integrate those rather than focusing on them in isolation. So some combination of reading, writing, listening, and speaking. The activities, oh, I'm so sorry, I have not advanced my slide. And then the activities that I present will fall into a more general lesson plan. So let's take a look at that general lesson sequence. Okay. So when incorporating a current event, whether it's an article or a video from the internet, I generally follow these steps. I'll start with a warm-up to introduce the topic. After introducing the topic, I like to select a handful of words that I anticipate will be new for my students. I'll introduce the words before we approach the news source. Then I'll give them that article or show the news clip. At this point in the lesson, we'll focus on the content, the comprehension of my students on that example of news. How well did they understand the content? And then from there, I'll use the content to highlight a specific language target. Again, I want to focus on teaching the language and not teaching the news. In the final part of the lesson, I will ask students to apply that language target in a student-created context. So rather than using the news article anymore, I'd like to take that language lesson and have the students apply it in their own work. So let's take a look at warm-ups first. So when we talk about warm-ups, what we're doing is activating that background knowledge. What do the students already know about this topic? For me, my goals in a warm-up are these two questions. What do my students know about the topic already? And what words do they use to talk about this topic? So I want to know what their lexical resource is. What words do they already have? And how can I add to that by teaching vocabulary? And now, there's a lot of different ways to get this information from my students. So I'm only going to talk about a few methods of activating background knowledge, but feel free to check out James Andrew Farmer's article, which is on the Ning, How to Effectively Use News Articles in the EFL Classroom. He presents many ideas on how to activate background knowledge. One thing I do in my classes is ask the students to predict the contents of an article or a news segment just by looking at the title or pictures related to the topic. I might ask them to relate the topic of the article to their own lives by asking them opinion or brainstorming questions. I also might ask them to create a set of questions that they think will be answered when we read or listen to the news story. I find that this kind of increases the students' engagement in the lesson if they're creating the comprehension questions. So it's a fun activity in the classroom. Let's take a look at an example. So recently in my classroom, the students read an article about immigration, which is a topic that my students are interested in. Again, I'm working with university students who are here, so they themselves have moved to a different country. And so this might not be a topic that is suitable for all contexts, but it was certainly a good topic for my students. And so what I did was I showed a picture of a passport and the Statue of Liberty, and I asked them to do some basic word association exercises, like what are the first 10 words you think of when you hear the word immigration? And after we do a little bit of word association, I asked them a handful of discussion questions to see what they already know about the topic. So these are the questions that I used here. Do you like traveling? What steps do you have to take when you want to travel? What are some reasons people move to a new country? And what might some of the challenges be when you move to another country? So after this discussion part, I gave them the headline of the story. And here, I apologize. I've progressed a little bit further than I meant to. And so I might ask the students to, again, come up with questions that they think will be answered. We'll pool these questions in a larger discussion and then revisit them later after we've read the article or listened to the newscast. And then the last step of this warm-up that I like to do with students is pre-teaching of vocabulary. So depending on the article, I might choose maybe 8 to 10 vocabulary words. And I do this for two reasons. One, I want to expand their vocabularies with this topic, but also, in my experience, it leads to smoother reading or listening. When students are reading or listening and they encounter a word they don't know, it can be really distracting. So they might pause to look up a word in their dictionaries and then kind of lose focus of the larger article, maybe lose a little bit of that comprehension. So if you could share in the chat box, what are some ways you introduce new words to your students? And as that's kind of coming up here, I'll share with you the words that I I see games, flashcards, hangman game. Interesting. I like that reinforces spelling. Songs, opposites, audio. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing these. Pictures. Yes, that can really help visual learners remember the meaning of new words. So for this example lesson that I did recently with immigration, I introduced visa, immigrant, border, legal, illegal, rights, refugee, and resettlement. Let's take a look back at lesson sequence. So far in this example lesson, we've looked at lesson warm-ups and the pre-teaching of vocabulary. Now let's take a quick second to talk about comprehension checks. So here we go. Generally, I like to give my students some comprehension questions, whether it's reading or listening, because this can help them focus. They're easy to create, but my rule is generally no more than 8 per article or news clip, because I don't want them reading only for the purpose of those comprehension questions. Sometimes I will share these with the students beforehand, and sometimes I might choose to share them afterwards. Again, my students are hoping to go to an English-speaking university, so I might want to reinforce the skill of note-taking if it's a reading or listening. So I might want them to try to organize the information on their own before giving them the questions. It depends on what learners you're working with. And then we will listen or read the news story a couple of times until we're all set on what the content was. And finally, we'll revisit those questions that the students created in the warm-up. So that can be like a fun part of the lesson to see which questions were answered that they had predicted would be answered. Let's take a look at those types of questions. So when I create these questions, I want to vary the question type. Some of them might have to do with the most important ideas, and some might have to do with details. So an example of with the immigration article we read, what is the new policy, right? That might be one of the main ideas of the article. And then details might have to do with specific numbers or dates. I also might want to ask the students inference-based questions. How did the person interview feel about the new immigration policy? So answers to questions that require inferencing aren't directly in the text. So it takes a student, it's a little bit more difficult and challenging where they have to think about how something was said and what words were used to say it. I also like to highlight a grammatical, again, language. So it might be a grammatical function. Why did the journalist use passive voice here? What tense is this article mostly written in? And these questions aren't necessarily focused on meaning, but again, are a good transition to the language focus, which is the next part of the lesson. So raise your hand if you also create these kinds of questions for your students when you're using the news to read or listen to. Wow, okay, good. It seems like we've got some similar teaching styles. Very interesting. So we've talked about the first couple of steps. Now is the most exciting part for me, at least, the focus on the language. We want to refocus the lesson at this point from the topic of the current event to the language of the current event. So I'm going to share with you a couple of activities that I've used in the classroom, one of which has a listening focus, another has a fluency focus. We'll look at one that has a pronunciation focus, and then we'll look at a couple of integrated activities. And most activities are integrated, require students to do multiple skills. So let's first look at a language-focused listening activity. So one thing I've noticed about using a video or a radio clip from the internet is that oftentimes the transcript is available, and transcripts can be a great learning tool for students. You can see here that I used a transcript from an audio clip from a website called StoryCorps, which is a radio program. It houses thousands of personal interviews and narratives, and they're categorized by current event or a hot topic. So for this particular class, we were focusing on prepositions like in, on, of, by, within. And prepositions in spoken English can be hard to catch as a listener. They're rarely stressed by the speaker. So for this intermediate level class, I took the transcript of a story with the story is about a man's encounter with the police, a topic that we had talked about in class, and I removed the preposition. So again, the idea of talking about the police was something that worked for my learners in my cultural context. It may not be what everyone can use in their classroom. So again, taking account into the comfortability of the students, the comfort level of the students. So before we move on, raise your hand if you don't have access to speakers in your classroom, if you don't have a way for students to listen. Okay. It does seem like a lot of people don't have access to speakers. Well, even if you do have access to speakers, sometimes technology is not always reliable. So in these cases, I become the journalist and read the story aloud. So if you have access to the transcript, a reading activity can quickly turn into a listening activities. So that's another benefit of having access to the transcript. Let's take a look at this listening activities sequence. So again, we would start with a warm-up, asking students what they already know about the topic or the language that they're using. And then we'd listen twice to the story, asking some simple comprehension questions. What happened to the storyteller when he was pulled over? Why does he think he was pulled over? And then this again is where we're going to get into the meat of the lesson, the language part. So here they're listening for specific words, those prepositions. And here's an example of how prepositions are kind of difficult to hear. I have to go by the store on my way home from work. I have to go by the store on my way home from work. So you can hear that I'm kind of stressing more of the content words, go, store, home, not really hearing the prepositions. So that, for my students in this lesson, the focus was to hear those prepositions. And the last part of this lesson, the application part, is that I'll ask students to create a small script or something that they've previously written and practice adding this kind of rhythm to their talking. So I want them to now try to gloss over that preposition and add that rhythm. So this was the example of a listening activity that kind of turns into a speaking activity. And sometimes I'd like to use activities that are slightly more fluency focused. So I'm going to switch activities here. And let's talk about speaking skills. So one thing I like to do in class is have my students talk more than I talk. And so here the focus is on fluency, speaking a lot and having the words come to you quickly. So the general idea of this activity is to ask students to choose different current events to follow over the course of a week. So I can kind of structure this activity by selecting 4 or 5 current events and assigning them to students, or I can leave it totally open-ended and allow them to pick whatever event they're interested in. And hopefully that will kind of turn into engagement if the students have a little bit more choice. So the assignment is to lead a discussion with their classmates. So in groups of 4, the speaker needs to summarize the current event or issue, introduce new keywords or vocabulary for that particular issue, and then finally, they need to lead a discussion with the other members of the group about this current event. So remember, the other group members haven't read about this current event, so they're relying on the summary and those new words from the discussion leader. And one thing I do before I have this activity in my class is discuss with the students what's the difference between a question that leads to discussion and just a question in general. So here's an example. If a student wanted to talk about how the World Cup was going to announce the location of its next tournament. So we said, an information question would just ask for something that someone can answer, not even in a sentence. So when is the next World Cup? But a discussion question, that would encourage people to add their opinion and say a little bit more about it. So what are the advantages for a country hosting the World Cup? So if discussion is the language focus of this particular activity, I generally like to introduce and explicitly teach phrases that signal an opinion and phrases that signal agreement or disagreement. So I teach this explicitly because I found that students tend to rely on a phrase that they know, like I think, or they don't use a marker at all and they present an opinion as though it's fact. So even if my students are familiar with some of these phrases, I want to encourage them to use different ones that they rely on. And I also want them to encourage their group members to talk. So let's take a look at the language first. So if I teach my students how to ask each other for opinions, what do you think? What's your position? What are your thoughts about this? How do you feel about this? Then I'll teach students how to introduce their opinion. Here's the most common. In my opinion, my point of view on this is, in my experience, personally, I think, and I strongly or really believe or feel that. And again, these are the phrases that I ask my students to use when they're participating in this discussion. For agreeing, I'll teach these phrases. Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I see exactly what you mean. You're right. That's a good point. I couldn't agree with you more. Exactly. That's just what I was thinking. And finally, I present these phrases to my students to signal disagreement. I'm sorry to disagree with you, but I'm afraid I must disagree. Yes, but don't you think? I see your point, but I'm not so sure about that. I understand what you're saying, but... So one aspect of disagreement that I like to talk to my students about when introducing these phrases is the idea of softly or politely disagreeing. Sometimes in discussion with friends or family, even classmates, a person can flat out disagree with someone. Maybe they're saying, "You're wrong." But in other settings, there might be a slightly more formal expectation. So I like to tell my students that disagreement doesn't always result in an argument. So the picture you see on the right side of the screen, it's a tool that I use to encourage my students to use those different phrases. So what I've done is I've just cut up these phrases that I just introduced over these last couple of slides, and I've taped them to playing cards. And I like to distribute 3 or 4 to each student right before we have a class discussion. And the rule is that by the end of the conversation, they've used the phrases that are in their hand, and then they switch for the next discussion. So they're constantly being exposed to those different phrases of opinion language or agreeing and disagreeing or asking each other for their opinions. And if you don't have index cards, if you don't have playing cards, I've used index cards or any pieces of paper. But the idea is just getting students to use different phrases rather than the stock phrases that they already have. So let's pause here. If you could raise your hand if you also use these phrases or teach these phrases to your students. These kinds of opinion language or agreement language. Wow, okay. So it looks like a lot of people are also teaching these kinds of discussion gambits in their class. Great. So this was an activity that focuses on fluency. Now I'd like to talk about an activity that focuses on a different aspect of speaking. Let's look at a pronunciation feature, a lesson that focuses on pronunciation. So in my class, we've been focusing on creating speech rhythm, kind of similar to what we talked about with prepositions. And here I introduced to my students 3 concepts in pronunciation: stress, pausing, and intonation. So pausing happens between thought groups, and thought groups are units of speech between which the voice naturally pauses, kind of like what I just did there, between which the voice naturally pauses. Stress is that emphasis placed on a word or phrase, and sometimes emphasis is expressed because the speaker says it louder, sometimes they say it higher, and sometimes they say it longer, right? And then finally, intonation. This is a speaker's gradual increase or decrease over the course of several words. So generally, the voice sweeps down at the end of a sentence. And with a yes/no question, it might sweep up. So these are the 3 things that this lesson focuses on language-wise. And so this activity uses a transcript similar to the listening activity, but it's slightly less comprehensive. It doesn't need to be as long of a transcript. And what I like to do is give my students maybe 5 or 6 sentences to listen for over the course of a broadcast and mark the transcript with these speech features. So they'll put a slash where they hear a pause, a double underline where they hear stress, and these sweeping arrows up and down where they hear intonation patterns. So here's an example. We have last year, Americans elected a new president who will serve for the next 4 years. So you can hear my voice pause right after those first 2 words, and then before that dependent clause in the end, and stress those content words, Americans new for. And then finally, at the end of the sentence, my voice sweeps down. So these are the features that I'm asking my students to listen for. So so here are some activity steps to use this kind of lesson in your classroom. So the first thing that I do is find a news source, again, looking at appropriateness and complexity, student interest. And again, if you don't have access to speakers, you can use that transcript and you can be the newscaster as the teacher. Once you have the transcript, select a couple of sentences that you'd like the students to listen for. And then I generally play the news clip 3 times, 1 for pausing, 1 for stress, and 1 for intonation. It makes it easier for the students to really focus on listening for that feature. After that, I ask the students to use their marked transcript to imitate the speaker. So I like them to pause where the speaker paused, stress the words the speaker stressed. And then finally, I want the students to apply these pronunciation features to something that they've created. So maybe the assignment is for them to create a broadcast script, and I want them to decide where are they going to pause, what are they going to emphasize, what kind of intonation patterns they want to use. So I'd like to show you an example. So again, the thought groups, the stress, and the intonation. I know it's a little difficult to see. I'm sorry about that. This is from a news clip, NBC Nightly News that I found online about a 15-year-old inventor whose grandfather had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he invented a sock that helped when his grandfather wandered. So it was a nice inspirational news clip for the students. And this is what it looked like when they were done marking the text. So they're using those same markings to show that intonation pattern. And I like to tell the students that there's not just one right answer. Sometimes somebody might hear an intonation pattern and the other person hears stress, and that's okay. Everybody's might look a little different, as long as we're listening for those features and hearing those features and can identify generally those features and what they're for, the purpose of those features. So again, I wouldn't use this activity in isolation. It's only after we understand the topic and the news clip itself that I would introduce that language focus. So again, we do a warm-up. I'd ask students, what does it mean to have memory loss? How does it happen? I might pre-teach some vocabulary words like Alzheimer's, wandering, device. And then I would ask them comprehension questions just to make sure they totally understand what they're hearing. What's the invention? How old is the inventor? What was his inspiration? And how does it work? And after we are set on the topic and the comprehension, that's when I go to the language focus. So at this point, I like to give them the rationale why we're doing this. In general, broadcast journalists are aware and intentional with the way that they speak, and that makes them really good subjects for ESL learners. People who are broadcasting the news, they speak in a certain way to maximize listening potential. So that's why I use this kind of activity with my students. Then I'll give a mini lesson on thought groups, stress, and intonation. And then we'll listen and mark the text. And again, application. Student mimics the original speaker and then applies it in their next speaking assignment. So that's just an example of a pronunciation activity that incorporates the news. And I'd like to move on to maybe some writing assignments and integrated tasks. So let's pause for a poll. As we're moving into writing, what kinds of writing assignments have you done with your students that incorporate the news? Here's just a couple of ideas. I'm sure there are more than just these 5 that I posted, but we have summary writing or opinion writing, student newsletter, maybe blog posts that use social media, or letters to the editor. And thank you so much for answering the poll. It looks like a lot of people talk about opinion writing, which is great. I can't wait to share some of these ideas on the Ning afterwards. And also summary writing. Summary writing is a great academic skill. So I'm glad that we're all interested in using the news for writing activities. Thank you for posting in. So I'm going to present a project that I've done with students in the past. And it does incorporate writing, but it also has a lot of other language features. So let's talk about creating a student newspaper. I have to advance my slides, excuse me. So if I'm asking students to pretend to be reporters and write their own news stories, generally I might want to use this method of teaching called the genre approach. So the linguist John Swales has named this approach, the genre approach. And really what I'm asking students to do is investigate the features of a certain type of writing. So I want them to look at several news articles or listen to several news broadcasts. And what do they hear? What do they have in common? You can use the genre approach in a couple of with different genres like poetry or writing an email to complain to a business. But here we're using it just as news articles. So the first step is really researching the news itself, the style of print journalism or broadcast journalism. We'll examine how are the articles laid out? How are the articles structured? What's the tone? What tenses are used? These are all questions that I might use to help the students find the features that I hope that they find. So one thing that we kind of talked about earlier is this idea of the inverted pyramid. So like just an upside down triangle where the most important information is presented first in a news story. And then the later paragraphs have the details. And we kind of talked about this earlier when we talked about how it differs from a lot of the other writing that we might ask our students to do. And so discovering this style of news writing is what I hope to do before I ask the students to write their own stories. So they're noticing that those essential questions, who, what, where, when, that's answered first. And then other details are presented throughout the article. Another thing I might want to introduce with the students in this research phase is I want them to use the vocabulary of article layout and sources. So there's specific words for these parts of an article. So I want the students to notice the headline or the title. I want them to notice the byline, which is where the writer signs their name, maybe the date and time. The lead, which I spelled L-E-A-D, but it is sometimes spelled L-E-D-E. That's that first paragraph, again, that has the most essential information. The body of the articles, that's where the details are. Those are the paragraphs after the lead. They might have quotes or other details. And then finally, the conclusion, which might have a resource that the writer wants the readers to know about. It depends on what the content is, but I like to introduce these parts of an article, and I want the students to use that vocabulary as they plan their article. Also, many articles have pictures or graphs, and right below that, journalists write a small sentence describing it called a caption. So as you can see, these are the aspects of print journalism, and they all have names, and the students are kind of discovering this in the pre-lessons, that genre approach, identifying those features. And then also, I want to ask the students to think about the sources that appear in different news articles, whether it's a quote or just a named source. Because if I'm going to ask students to go out and interview and research stories, I want them to think about the different types of people that could add perspective to their story. So eyewitnesses, people who have seen something happen. Then we have related people, meaning the people who are actually involved, like a politician in an election. Experts can be like scholars on the topic, maybe a professor whose research focuses on that topic. And then people in authority, people whose job it is to monitor the laws and the rules. And this changes from story to story, but it's good for students to know as they plan their own stories. Okay, so let's take a look at the steps for integrating this lesson. After researching the genre, my students are ready to write. Here's the process that I use for this activity. In groups of 5 to 8 students, students first decide on a newspaper name. And I'm sure, not surprisingly, this is the most exciting part of the lesson for them when they get to decide their newspaper name. After that, they pitch story ideas to see which ones will end up in their newspaper. They, as a group, have to decide whether they will have international stories, local stories, stories that focus just their country, stories about sports, stories about business, stories about an event. It really could be any number of types of stories, but they as a group should decide what they want to cover. Now it's time to write. So they're going to draft their stories individually, and then they'll come back one more time to meet as a group to provide feedback to one another, kind of like a peer review. So they'll edit for grammar and vocabulary, but also revise for overall genre features. We want to make sure that it's following the same sequence that a newspaper does. And then at the end, they submit their collection as a group project, and groups can swap newspapers and read each other's work, which is what we call publishing their newspaper, when they get to see each other's. So there's a couple reasons that I really like this project. One of which is that it's truly integrated. The students are using reading, speaking, listening, and writing for all of this. They're discussing as a group, which is using those listening and speaking skills. They're interviewing sources, again, using those speaking and listening skills. But they're also reading a lot of news in the genre analysis, right? When they're trying to figure out what the features are. And then, of course, they're writing at the end. So this also, they can use those, the language for expressing an opinion and agreement and disagreement in their group meetings. So I like that this is truly an integrated skills project. I also like that it provides an opportunity for the students to read each other's work. Many times I'm assigning a writing assignment, and then I get to read it and I give it a grade. But in this project, students get to see what each other's doing. And so they're kind of writing for a new audience. It gives them like a different motivation. And lastly, depending on what kind of resources you have at your school or in your area, this newsletter can take several forms. It could be low tech. It could just be several sheets of paper stapled together. Or it could be high tech, where students are designing the layout on the computer, or even putting it entirely online using like a blogging tool, right? Like Blogger or WordPress. They can also share them on Facebook or social media. So students love being able to connect outside of class. So it's really about the language, not how it's distributed, but there are so many options that it can become very student-centered, deciding how the students want to distribute their work. So if we could just raise our hands. Do you think your students would enjoy this type of project or benefit from it? Do you think that they'd be able to participate in it? Okay, so that's great. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of people thinking that this could help with language development, and that's the whole point. So we've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to present a couple of other writing ideas. Sorry to speed through. Many of you talked about summarizing, which is great. It's a great academic skill, and students can read articles and share information quickly by summarizing them. Another idea is letters to the editor. Again, that has its own features, it's its own genre. But I had a student once that wrote a letter to the editor of a local campus newspaper, and it was printed. And the excitement on his face when he got to see his name in print and his words published was just really special. And then raise your hand if your students are connected and active in social media. Sorry, I think the hands might still be raised from the last time I asked you to do it. But I've seen a lot of you post about this on the Ning and in the chat box. It does seem like a lot of people are connecting with their students online. And so actually in the class that I'm teaching right now, I'm teaching students these kind of Twitter vocabulary, like SMH or shake my head. And that is when like somebody posts something that they disagree with or that they're like maybe a little nervous about, or ICYMI in case you missed it, right? So, oh, check out this article or this video. It's really important. I think people should see it. Hashtag FF or follow Fridays. That's like when you're giving a suggestion to someone like, oh, have you seen this website? Hashtag FF. And of course, then there's like regular hashtags, right? If people are talking about the World Cup. But I just really love that my students are connecting outside of class. I think it creates even more community inside of class. And it is its own genre, right? This is its own vocabulary, SMH, the way the world is changing. So it's exciting to kind of study this with them. Wow, okay. And finally, here's just a couple of links that I use when I'm looking for ways to incorporate news lessons into my teaching. The first one was actually already introduced at the beginning of this, the Coursera journalism course, which I had the absolute honor to work on with many people behind the scenes. And as they said, a new session is starting on February 20th, and there are maybe 50 videos and different articles that are made for students with language focus, but also with news content. And so that could be a great free resource. Also, Breaking News English, Newsella, Share America, VOA, all of those are tailored for English language learners, so they might not be as authentic, but they're tailored from authentic pieces of writing. So the vocabulary and I find them to be pretty well suited for news, meeting the genre, but also good for students. And some of these websites have lesson ideas, which is great. So they're coming up with the warm-up questions and coming up with the vocabulary, which takes a little bit off the teacher's plate. And I saw that VOA will be presenting later this month, so that's great. You can learn even more about what VOA has to offer. And lastly, the StoryCorps website, which is what I used for one of my the prepositions listening exercise. StoryCorps has short, maybe 1 to 3 minute stories, and they're categorized by topic. So depending on what you're talking about in your classroom, you might be able to find a listening activity or a story there. And again, I would love to continue this discussion on the Ning. So if you have different resources, just today I learned about a different website from the pre-discussion, and I'm sure we can share even more in the post-discussion. So at this time, I'll share with you my references from this presentation, but thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to be connected with you and the teachers who are all over the world, and I'm so excited to continue this discussion in the post-discussion, so let's stay connected. Thanks again for joining the webinar.
Thank you so much, Eve, for sharing those exciting ideas for ways to use the news to teach English language skills. I think you offered us many options to use current events and other topics to connect with student interests and to bring authentic language into the classroom. So thank you again. I know our audience is excited to try some of the activities that you discussed today. And we all look forward to participating in that discussion you just mentioned about news resources on the Ning. I also want to say a big thank you to our fantastic audience. You've been active participants today, and we appreciate your sharing your thoughts and ideas. We look forward to learning with you in the next webinar in Series